So you're saying that the retreat that you did, that part of the emphasis was sort of opening the mind,
Yeah, yeah.
and that you equated that with something that you and I had talked about recently, in the sense that we can either focus in on, or we can expand or open and broaden, and we can use
Mm,
a symphony orchestra as an example,
mm,
that we can watch the violinist or we can watch the conductor, but really it takes, um, as it were, a different kind of concentration to
mm,
open up to the whole thing,
mm,
and that this is actually part of the process of, one way of looking at it is that, um, imagine that the mind is getting to the point of being able to focus, that it's all
mm,
over the place,
mm,
and that we use an object so
mm,
that we can begin to start touching that object. And
mm,
most of the people think that concentration means that you're pushing on it rather
mm,
than just merely occasionally touch it.
mm,
What we're actually then practicing is the ability to come and keep the mind there
mm,
without concentrating it, without pushing it, but
mm, mm,
but to allow it to become stable. Okay. Once it becomes stable, now we can draw it out,
mm,
so
mm,
that it's not that one point that we're touching. Now we're
mm,
getting a very, very large picture. That in fact, it's a way of
mm,
opening our perception by not doing a lot of perception.
mm,
Now, here, let me describe what I mean by that. Uh, in the teaching of Paticca Samuppada, which we have spent some time with,
mm,
we understand that we don't really live in the real world so much, that we live in a constructed reality.
mm,
And that an important point of that is that not only do we live in a constructed reality, but that we spend a lot of our time, our mind moments, constructing
mm,
reality,
mm,
taking what we see and the senses and all of that, and
mm,
then trying to make sense out of it,
mm,
or constructing a reality, trying to make sense out of it is another
mm,
way of saying it. And when we decide that we know what it all is, uh, then that would be like taking the internal senses and constructing something out of it, sort of like the distinction between being in a studio
mm,
with video cameras
mm,
versus the audience, which is actually in their room
mm,
looking at a TV screen. Okay, so the TV screen that we
mm,
have in our mind is really a whole lot different, just like the TV is a whole lot different than the studio
mm,
that the camera is in, right?
mm,
Um, and that we spend a lot of our time and effort in constructing and broadcasting and receiving and etc. the signal that
mm,
we're talking about. Okay. And that whole process then is listed under the label that we normally use in English language as perception.
mm,
Uh, or you could talk about it in the sense of recognition, but it's
mm,
the re part
mm,
that, that cognizes, okay? And
mm,
the redoing it is that perceptional thing,
mm,
and that we wind up spending a lot of time in that perception.
mm,
And so a lot of the then later practice, which some people would call deeper practice, but another way of saying is the lighter practice, is simply because we are now, once we're able to get the mind very stable, that we're withdrawing it from the objects that it became stable on. So rather than jumping from object to object to object to object, we get to the point that we can kind of hold a very small class of objects. And this is what we would call wholesome thoughts. That we would start limiting our thoughts from unwholesome and into the world of wholesome. Now, let me give you an example of that. In the regard, a lie is unwholesome and the truth is wholesome. Okay, if I ask you how old you are and you told me the truth, what would you say? In
34.
years?
34. Huh? 34.
34. Okay. And if you were to lie to me when I ask you how old you are in years, then what would you say?
47.
And if I ask you again, what would you say?
54.
And if I ask you again, what would you say?
370.
All right, now we're cooking. Now we're getting the point that the amount of different lies that we can tell on an individual question far exceeds the truth. That also puts us in the realm that wholesome thought is actually quite small, as opposed to unwholesome thought, which is quite broad. And also so the concept then is that if we begin to take the idea that we're going to start working with just wholesome and when we find unwholesome, to eliminate that, and we begin to do that throughout the day, throughout our lives, as well as a practice period that we would call a meditation session, all of that then means that as we begin to grow in the Dhamma, that our selectivity gets very keen. As our selectivity gets very keen, that means our ability to discriminate between what is wholesome and what is not wholesome means that we used to take all of this as wholesome and that stuff over there. Now we begin to say, wait a minute, this has got to go over there, and this has got to go over there, and we wind up having less and less and less that's actually wholesome. Because we can see the dangers in all of the unwholesome. In a way, you can say that it's kind of like boxing ourselves in or setting boundaries. And that the boundaries are normally set depending upon the way of the danger that can be seen in that. So the wholesome is going to be that which is always found to be safe, secure, serene, sabai, everything is okay. And that everything else needs to be inspected to see if it is dangerous or not. And if it's dangerous, then it's unwholesome. And so like an alcoholic that drinks, before they go to AA, they can see the gratification in the alcohol, but that they don't see the danger. Once they go to AA, they begin to wake up with the 12-step program to recognize what danger it is in their life to cross that boundary. So they set that boundary, saying, I'm not going to have even one drink. I'm going to draw a hard line. Well, guess what? Not only do Dhamma dudes do that with alcohol, and they are not alcoholics, they don't go to AA, but they kind of set that boundary. The Buddha said, okay, that, and we can see the dangers of it. It took me twice. I got drunk twice in my life, and after that, no more. No, I've seen it. I saw the dangers in it.
Just twice.
Huh?
Just twice.
Just twice. Once
Very
when
good.
I was in college and once later when I should have known better. So anyway, Once we see the danger in it,
Mm-hmm.
that will be then the escape from it.
Mm.
Though many people look at it as setting boundaries, saying, oh, I
Mm.
can't go there. And if I set all of these boundaries, then I'm boxing myself into something very small and very tight.
Mm.
But another way of looking at it is, no, what we really do have is we have a paradise here, and that instead of giving half of paradise to the other side of the boundary, we're just going to push the boundaries out. But it's still the same concept in the sense of now we're free from that.
Mm.
Now I'm free from this, now I'm free from that, and now I'm only, let us say, holding to those things which are wholesome. That the Buddha even talked about it, and there's a sutta by the name of, or at least it's translated into English, as one fortunate attachment.
Say that again, sorry.
There's a sutta by the name of one fortunate
Right.
attachment. It's sutta
Okay.
number 131 in the Majjhima Nikaya, but there's 4 or
Mm.
5 suttas right in a row that dwell with this.
Mm.
And what they're pointing at is that in most of Western Buddhism, they
Mm.
have the idea that we should not have any attachments. But the
Mm.
Buddha actually talked about 4 modes of clinging. And these 4 modes of clinging means we can set kind of 4 boundaries, or we can avoid those 4 things, but there's other things that are worth clinging to.
Mm.
And one of them would be to cling to the wholesome. Another would be cling to the Four Noble Truths. Another way of looking would be to cling to the here now, or attach
Mm.
ourselves to wholesome things, and to become free of the unwholesome. As
Mm.
we do that, we narrow things down completely.
Mm.
Once we've gotten that down to the mind is at that state. Now the
Mm.
mind can then be drawn out,
Mm.
and there's various analogies of that. Is that the analogy is the material object versus the mind-made object.
Mm.
Okay, if we begin to just let the object that exists exist in and of itself, we don't have to make anything of it,
Mm. Mm.
which means we don't have to spend any time doing that making of it. And
Mm.
we can spend more time observing instead. So going
Mm.
along with what we were talking about before with the orchestra is that you can imagine that the kid goes into the orchestra or to the concert, and he's all over the place. He's all gagging. He's playing with his
Mm.
popcorn, and mom says, just settle down and pay attention to what's going on.
Mm.
Okay. As he grows up and becomes expert, he may, in fact, finally figure out how to pay attention to what's going on. But his awareness is broad enough now that he's focused well enough now that it
Mm.
includes not only what all the orchestra is doing, but
Mm.
what's happening in the theater also. Because we're not taking and focusing on any one thing anymore.
Mm.
Ah, so one of the words in the English language that we have would be the word gazing.
Mm.
And gazing is different than looking, like
Mhm.
looking at or
Mm.
staring. So staring is really looking. Looking at is this. And gazing means that you're taking everything in,
Mhm.
not having an object or drawing
Mm.
back from it. So, in that regard, with Paticca Samuppada, we can also think of this as the qualities that we're looking at in, let us call it, not a strongly developed fourth jhana, but rather a vipassana fourth jhana that's actually rooted in the first jhana, but
Mm.
that our object becomes nothing.
Mm.
In
Mm.
the process of the object that we have is nothing, it means everything. And in that sense, we're now gazing by being open to everything, open to all of the senses, but we're not trying to make any sense out of it. By doing that, there's a separation between the consciousness and the perception map. The perception or the recognition or the recognizing part is now not given much juice, and we're spending more and more mind moments on just the observation, just the consciousness, just the input itself. And there's various ways of talking about that. And the joke is that the Dalai Lama, when he went to the UN, he went out on the street to the hot dog vendor and asked to have make me one with everything. Okay.
Yeah.
This is what we're talking about. How we become one with everything is by not creating our own version of it. That we become, we start to come out of the interior world that we have created and live in, and start functioning more in the real reality. And so this is a way of, and it's hard to describe to the students about what this is about, but it only comes about once the mind is capable of holding an object. Because now we're going to hold that object, but we're now going to hold more and more and more objects.
Okay,
so
I see.
in the beginning, with Anapanasati, we only begin to hold the breath as the object. That's to get us starting. But by the time we're actually fully practicing Anapanasati, it's got now 16 objects, all at the same time. Guess what?
The layer cake.
That's the begin. 16 is the beginner's crutch. We're looking for centipede style operation here.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. So, but in the process of doing that, see, by concentrating and focusing on the body, we're opening the sensory awareness so that we're really here in the body. In our environment, and having the environment contact us and touch us, and we get the sense of the touch of the cloth, and the whatever is contacting the body, or if it's the wind or whatever. So we get very attuned to the body as one of the things. The other part of it is we also get attuned to the body as it's not just sitting, but as it's relaxing, which would be step 4 of Anapanasati, to have the body completely relaxed. And then we go into the other stuff in the sense of enthusiastic about the practice, the piti, and the satisfaction with the practice. These are also skills to be developed, and we were going to start working with all of that. So you can see where once we get all of these skills built together, so that we're carrying around this joy and this sukha and this relaxation and this contact with the with our environment and all of that, that is very little left now to open up even more to the big it, the good old whatever it is, the one with everything, universal contact. And it basically has to do with let us say, one of the ways of saying it is to learn to not take an object. Here we spend all of this time working out and pushing out and having fewer and fewer objects so that we get the mind down to just a few objects, but it's a group of objects. These skills that we have developed. So we've got it focused down to just these very, very wholesome things. Once we have the mind focused on that, then we kind of let everything come back in. But it's still a lot to do with our senses rather than our internal processing.
Mm, mm,
So, a little going on with Paticca Samuppada. Bhikkhu Buddhadasa talks about it in the sense of wisdom at the point of contact.
mm, mm,
Wisdom at the point of contact, or at pasa, right before feelings or as the feelings are arising,
mm,
is a major, major point for students to begin to practice so that they know what they feel.
mm, mm,
Because that's the time to change how you feel, is when you're feeling easy and then you start to feel bad. You can say, I see that. Let me throw that out. And
mm,
I can come back and feel good again. All right. So
mm,
this is a major place for practice. But
mm,
then this new place that we're talking about is the new place of practice that we're backing up the process in time so that we're not putting wisdom at that point of contact of the mental object that we created. But now we're
mm,
at the point to where we're stopping making mental objects. We're no longer
mm,
trying to make sense out of the world. We're just there to experience it.
mm, mm,
Why? Because we've already deemed it safe.
mm,
Once it's safe, we can just allow it to be
mm.
without having to make sense out of it. Now, guess what? Humans, they don't like that so much sometimes because they want to try to make sense out of everything. They want to know, they want to demand, okay? And yet, we do have that sense of sometimes we get completely overwhelmed with sensory input.
Mm,
And that's when people automatically will go into that state. An example of that is during an explosion,
mm,
or let us say, walking out to the Grand Canyon and taking a vista
mm,
of something that's so magnificent and so huge
mm,
that people stand in awe of it.
mm.
Well, guess what? You can bring yourself right to that, right sitting right where you are, because that room. I mean, I look at that bookshelf and I'm in awe of that. Look how, I mean, it's mind blowing. Okay, so this is another way of talking about it in ordinary language, but that is very rare
Mm,
for people to have it.
mm,
That sense of awe. And yet we can find it. We can find it in spectacular music. We can find it
mm,
in concerts. Sometimes people find that in a sports situation.
mm,
But we really do like that sense of awe, that sense of being completely overwhelmed. And this is exactly what we're doing, except we're doing it consciously and we know how to do it.
mm. Well, I guess um, it's a way. It's a kind of divinity, maybe that's being spoken about, like the presence of something that you might call God, right? Which is
Absolutely. That's a good enough word for good old whatever it is.
yeah.
Most of the time, the word God is used in a very small sense,
Mm,
like a Christian God of the Iowa, where this is the whole show,
mm, mm,
our entire environment,
mm,
mostly closely, but
mm.
ultimately.
Ultimately is good. But I guess that leads to a sense of anatta as well. That kind of idea of part of the kind of
Bingo is exactly the loss of sense of
mm,
self.
mm,
Complete loss of the sense of self and just being melding into the environment,
mm, mm,
melding into being at one or at home finally.
mm, 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 mm. I mean, I can sort of get hints of that when I'm sitting, and there are moments when I experience it kind of in daily life, as it were, and those are really wonderful moments. But they're moments where you feel like quite strange as well. There's something kind of estranging, because you're not used to it, and that kind of
Yeah, we're used to living in a dangerous world. How marvelous it is and how strange it is to be in a world that's completely open.
mm, mm, mm.
In a way, we actually come in contact with how vulnerable we are.
Yeah.
And because of that vulnerability, we also understand how nurturing our environment really is.
Mm-hmm.
That it's almost like we're made for the environment, which is actually true. We evolved that way to fit in. And yet, so many of us in our society, we feel like we don't fit in somehow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I guess that we also have brains and like limbic systems and endocrinological systems that are kind of a bit excessively adapted, though. Like you can get pounding adrenaline just because someone owes you an email and is really disproportionate. And that's not even necessarily something to do with the modern world, but just sort of systems that are in play that you're not really in conscious control of, and events in your past that might have led you to feel a certain way at a given time. So I guess I'm thinking about that little boy in the orchestra. He's gone to see the performance, and one of the things he has to contend with is his own mind, right? His own
Absolutely. That's the
this
whole point.
the sixth
That
sense.
we've gotten to the point now that we don't have to contend with our mind anymore.
Mm,
That we
yeah.
can that we can sort of like um, how to say it. We can actually. It's almost like we carry the mind around like a cell phone, and we're constantly playing with it. We're
Mm,
not
mm,
paying attention to what's really going on. We're too interested in what our thoughts and so as we learn to put down a cell phone and pay
mm,
attention, so we
mm,
can also put down this mind
mm,
that's just yakety 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 and creating and trying to make sense out of it and
mm,
um, and and all of that kind of stuff,
mm,
and just set that toy down and just experience.
mm. When the mind is really going yakety yakety yak, which it has actually been for me this past week, does I mean what's the sort of, because there's acceptance, there's a kind of lightness of, there's a kind of equanimity you could apply to that, but there's also a kind of right effort which you could apply to trying to push those thoughts to one side and focus on the here now. Like in a kind of daily life kind of way. I mean, does it call for a combination of those approaches? Equanimity and right effort, or
First off, I will say that there are many, many activities
mm,
that we do throughout the day
mm,
that while we're doing those activities, the mind is focused on those activities.
mm,
And I'll
mm,
give you many examples, but one would be the example of playing a game like Sudoku or Solitaire or something like that. That while the person is playing the game, they're thinking
mm,
about the game and they're not thinking about all of life's troubles.
mm,
Well, uh, guess what? We can, in fact, find Anapanasati is kind of like that game of Sudoku
mm,
and occupy the mind that way. And the trick here is instead of finding the right number to put into the right box, is that work there, garden. Are you a wholesome thought or not? Are
mm,
you going to get allowed in here or not? Okay, and it
mm,
begins to be a game.
mm,
And so I know of People who
Okay.
say that I was tossing and turning in bed at night and thinking about all of that trouble I've got over there. And
Mm.
so I'd get up and I'd play a game of Sudoku. And after I played that game of Sudoku, I could recognize my mind was still for a while. I'd put the Sudoku and the cell phone down, go back to try to go to sleep. And then here come all of those thoughts again. All
Mm.
right. And so, in
Mm.
that regard, we're using the game of Sudoku to try to
Mm.
calm the mind down, which means to keep it from going yakety yakety yak.
Mm.
But if we have the skill, if the ordinary person has the skill to calm the mind down by having it focus, say, on a game of Sudoku, we can focus it also on our practice of Anapanasati wherever we are. That in
Mm.
fact, the Buddha makes a point of it, and there's a sutta about it, that just simply sitting and listening to someone talk about the Dhamma
Mm.
is sufficient for someone to go into first jhana. Why?
Mm.
Because the Dhamma that we're talking about is, for one thing, is wholesome. If we're thinking about the wholesome, then we're already free from hindrances, and that's the biggest deal. That's the biggest item on the list of first jhana, is to get rid of those hindrances. Okay?
Mm.
And now we're recognizing, well, where those hindrances are is stuff that we just keep recognizing or recognizing, reinventing, remanufacturing over and over and over again. So
Mm.
in the beginning, we learn to put wholesome in that process.
Mm.
And then later, we start starving it of fuel.
Mm.
Okay, because we're just staying right in the here now. We're not going to be using any of the fuel from the past. We're not trying to recognize, we're not trying to make sense out of it. We're just
Mm.
here to enjoy it.
Mm.
And so we stop thinking about not the problems of the day, but we stop thinking about Sudoku and everything else and just let sensory input just
Mm.
be here. Just, it's so nice.
Mm.
Nice weather, nice greenery.
Mm.
Everything is really cool. Everything is sabai, sabai. And it's an ordinary human state, not
Mm.
magical.
Mm.
It's just being at peace, being at
Mm.
rest, being at
Mm.
home in the environment.
Mm.
And so that's part of the practice of anapanasati.
Mm.
But how we get to it is by being aware of these feelings as they arise. To look at the
Mm.
thoughts that we have. When the mind is going yakety yak, can
Mm.
you make it yakety yak about something else?
Mm. Okay, yeah.
An example of that is you get a piece of music stuck in your mind.
Mm. Yep, happens.
Well, the best way to get a piece of music that's stuck in the mind unstuck is by playing a different tune.
Mm.
But it can get really complicated
Mm.
in the sense that I got Scheherazade, Rimsky-Korsakov, stuck in the mind. And so I used Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue to get
Rhapsody
rid
in
of it.
Blue.
And now the mind bounces back and forth between Rhapsody in Blue and Scheherazade. So I need a new tune.
Yeah, yeah.
So this is how the mind works. It uh, bounces back and forth
Mm.
all over the place. Can we
Mm.
settle it down?
Mm.
Then, once we get that, can we settle it not only to that group of, but we expand the number of
Mm.
objects? That's basically what we're saying. But um, we're not expanding it out to the point that we allow the unwholesome in, but rather that we see everything
Mm.
as uh, metanoia, as there to do you good. This is your
Mm.
home. This is your
Mm.
environment. This is your
Mm.
support system.
Mm.
Everything is okay.
Mm. Mm.
Everything is out to do you good.
Mm.
Friends in all quarters.
Okay. Cool. All right, Dhammarato. Sounds like you've got another call, so that was very helpful, and I'll be applying that when I sit. Thank you.
Okay. So I've given you several pointers about the yakety mind. Is
Yeah.
go yak at something else or play a game of Sudoku, but most importantly, be on guard to only allow the yakking to be wholesome yakking.
Okay. Wholesome yakking.
Wholesome yakking, exactly. Not not
Okay.
not not junk thoughts.
Mm, mm. Okay.
Uh, but another way of looking at it is a way of brightening the mind.
Mm, mm,
Gladdening the mind is the same as brightening, but brightening also has the quality of opening. So you can see, in fact, that gladdening and brightening and opening all are going in the same direction.
mm,
And that is out of the unwholesome into the wholesome
mm,
until the whole universe is completely wholesome.
mm. Okay, I'll keep that in mind. All right, thank you. Speak to you soon. Thanks a lot, Dhammarato. Bye.
Okay, bye bye.